Attack in France. French officials reveal new details about a gunman who killed a police officer on the Champs-Élysées. Home at last.
We are very happy to have Aya back home.
A look at the secret deal to free an American aid worker detained in Egypt for 3 years. Suspect arrested. New information in the bombing of a German soccer team's bus, including a possible motive. Italian pride. A new exhibit shows off the Holy Father's roots. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, April 21st, 2017. Thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. President Trump says yesterday's terror attack in Paris will probably help France's far-right presidential candidate when voting begins on Sunday. And now we're learning the shooter in the attack had a note with him defending ISIS when he opened fire on police officers on the capital's most famous boulevard. Paris's iconic Champs-Élysées is open to traffic again, the day after a gunman killed a police officer, wounded 2 others, and a female German tourist. Police shot and killed the gunman, 39-year-old Frenchman Karim Sherfi. Investigators found a pump-action shotgun and knives in his car and confirmed his identity from his fingerprints. The attack came less than 72 hours before polls open in France's presidential election.
Et nous serons d'une vigilance absolue.
French President François Hollande pledging absolute vigilance ahead of the vote. A key question is how the attack might affect French voters. President Donald Trump commented Thursday as the news broke.
Our condolences from our country to the people of France. Again, it's happening, it seems. I just saw it as I was walking in.
And the president is inserting himself into the debate, saying on Twitter, the people of France will not take much more of this. Will have a big effect on presidential election. François Hollande and the French Prime Minister are meeting today to review security plans. The Prime Minister urging his countrymen, quote, not to succumb to fear. And today, French police are paying tribute to the officer who was gunned down, a scene now depressingly familiar after multiple attacks that have killed more than 230 people in France over 2 years. Cardinal Von Troyes, Archbishop of Paris, says Sunday evening's Mass at the Cathedral of Notre Dame will be celebrated for the victims of the attack and for peace in France. An Egyptian-American aid worker held captive for 3 years in Egypt is suddenly released, flown to the United States, and whisked to the Oval Office to meet with President Trump. Aya Hijazi and her husband were accused of child abuse and human trafficking, but U.S. officials say the accusations are bogus. President Trump and his aides worked for several weeks with Egypt's president to secure their release, along with 4 other humanitarian workers. Joining us now is Samuel Tadros, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute Center for Religious Freedom. Sam, what did you think when you first heard the Trump administration had worked with Egypt to get Aya Hijazi and her husband released?
Well, at first it was great news to hear that Aya got acquitted in her court case in Egypt, that she's coming home to America. She's been unjustly held for over 3 years. It's been a trial and a process that has really troubled a lot of people about what it tells about Egypt's human rights record, but also about Egypt's relationship to the United States.
Well, why do you think this is happening now? I mean, couldn't have this had happened under the Obama administration?
Probably not. The Egyptian regime didn't like President Obama at all. They had a very hard relationship between them. The Obama administration was viewed as more supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood that Sisi had removed from power. And thus Egypt was trying, in a sense, to annoy the United States in every way possible, including by continuing to hold an American citizen.
Do you think it's unusual for the U.S. to negotiate the release of Americans held in foreign countries?
No, we've done it before with Iran when they hold the hikers or other cases. There have been all these cases where the United States, either directly or through other countries acting as intermediaries, has attempted to release its citizens held abroad.
Well, as you know, Sam, the United States gives over $1 billion to Egypt in aid every year. ISIS is very active in that nation. They want to target Christians. Does the U.S. have any leverage in protecting Christians there, fighting extremism?
Well, it certainly has leverage over issues that the Egyptian regime doesn't view as life and death issues. When it comes to questions that involve the survival of the regime, it's unlikely to agree to U.S. demands. But when it comes to issues that do not involve the regime's survival, such as protecting Christians, the U.S. can certainly start a conversation in Egypt and convince them to do their part, the government's part, in order to protect those vulnerable communities.
Samuel Tadros, Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute Center for Religious Freedom. Thanks so much for your analysis.
Thanks for having me.
President Donald Trump says businesses and individuals will receive a massive tax cut under a tax reform package he plans to unveil next week. The details have not been released. It will come a few days before President Trump's 100-day mark in office. Arkansas carries out its first execution in nearly a dozen years. Liddell Lee was put to death last night with a lethal injection, ending a week of legal wrangling as Arkansas scrambled to execute 8 men before the end of April. Mark Irons reports from the U.S. Supreme Court. Mark?
Wyatt, the High Court nearly halted the execution of 51-year-old Liddell Lee. Judge Neil Gorsuch was the pivotal vote in a 5-4 decision that ultimately rejected Lee's last-minute appeal. Arkansas has set the nation's most ambitious death penalty schedule since capital punishment was restored in 1976.
Liddell Lee was on death row for the 1993 murder of his neighbor, Deborah Reese. Lee killed Reese with a tire tool her husband had given her for protection.
Justice for the first time since 1993 for Deborah Reese's family.
Arkansas plans to execute 3 more inmates next week. The state originally scheduled 8 executions over an 11-day period before their supply of a lethal drug expires at the end of April. 3 have been canceled in court this week, and other inmates have received stays. But the planned executions have sparked outrage on social media and protest in Little Rock.
I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
In a statement, Catholic Mobilizing Network, a group that seeks an end to the death penalty, says, "A drug's expiration date should not be the contingent factor for the expedited execution of these 8 men." Critics describe Arkansas as rushing to the death chamber.
Lights out.
Voices as diverse as actor Johnny Depp and Bishop Anthony Taylor of Little Rock are speaking out.
We are no different from the crowd that called for Jesus' death, because we continue to call for the death of criminals.
The teaching of the church does not exclude recourse to the death penalty, but the Catechism of the Catholic Church says today the cases when it's an absolute necessity are very rare, if not practically non-existent.
Dissenting Justice Stephen Breyer describes Arkansas's decision to move forward with executions based on the expiration date of a lethal drug as being, quote, close to random. Arkansas could see more legal challenges next week as 3 executions are planned in the state. Wyatt?
Mark Irons reporting from the Supreme Court. Thanks, Mark. Democratic Governor Terry McAuliffe spares the life of a man on death row in Virginia. Yvonne Telegus was found guilty in 2006 of hiring another man to kill his girlfriend. He was scheduled to die on Tuesday. The governor commuted his sentence to life in prison in a murder for hire because he says jurors were given false information. Former President George H.W. Bush remains in the hospital, but he's in good spirits as he's visited by another former president, his son. The Twitter account for the 41st president featured this message: "Big morale boost from a high-level delegation. No father has ever been more blessed or prouder." George H.W. Bush was admitted to the hospital 1 week ago for treatment for a persistent cough and pneumonia. German police arrest a 28-year-old man suspected of bombing a soccer team's bus last week. They believe he launched the attack in an odd scheme to make money. A team player and a police officer were injured in the attack as they were heading to a game. The suspect came to the attention of investigators because he took out a 5-figure loan to bet on a drop in the club's stock on the day of the attack. Notes left at the scene blame ISIS, but prosecutors say they were fake notes left by the suspect who acted alone. At least 12 people are dead in Venezuela following violence in the country's capital. It comes amid massive protests against President Nicolas Maduro, who's accused of leading the government towards a dictatorship. Protesters also blame him for triple-digit inflation, rising crime, and food shortages. Opposition leaders say the government is repressing protesters with tear gas. Nearly 30 hostages, including members of Qatar's royal family, are released from captivity in Iraq. The hostages were kidnapped over a year ago in southern Iraq. They were released after the Qatari government helped broker a deal to evacuate 4 besieged towns in Syria. U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis says Syria still has chemical weapons.
There can be no doubt in the international community's mind that Syria has retained chemical weapons in violation of its agreement and its statement that it had removed them all. There is no longer any doubt.
The statement follows Syria's deadly chemical attack against civilians, which prompted a U.S. missile strike in retaliation. Mattis is in Tel Aviv to meet with Israeli leaders, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Pope Francis embarks on an important trip next week. He's leaving for Egypt on Friday. Ed Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register, joins us. Ed, as you know, ISIS is targeting Christians in Egypt. They've already bombed churches and killed dozens of people. Why is the Pope going to Egypt at this time, especially when it seems so dangerous?
Well, there are 3 reasons really why. The first is to bring solidarity to the Christians there. There are many Christian Coptic Orthodox believers there. There are also a very small minority of Catholics there, just 272,000. But he wants to bring solidarity to them. He also wants to further ecumenical relations with Pope Tawadros II, who's the head of the Coptic Orthodox Church, and who he has good relations with, and also thirdly to further relations with Islam. And he's very keen, Pope Francis, to better relations with Islam, and I think he sees this as an opportunity to do that in obviously a very strongly Muslim majority country.
Well, when it comes to prejudice and persecution of Christians, it's not just ISIS. Christians in that country have felt persecution for a long time, as you mentioned, in a Muslim majority country. What more can be done to protect them? Well, the Christians are persecuted in Egypt, but not to the extent of, say, other countries, obviously like Syria and Iraq. There is a discrimination against them, and they have had these sporadic attacks against them, but generally relations can be quite good between Muslims and Christians in the country, especially under the new leadership of President El-Sisi. There's also problems, though, with that, in that although he's brought the rule of law to the country, there's still restrictions on religious freedom, and there's discrimination in the workplace. So there is certainly a way to go there for Christians, but they are protected, and I think what people would like to see is perhaps the international community working to ensure that the Christians there are protected from groups such as ISIS. Well, how do you think Pope Francis is using this trip to unify Christians and Muslims and promote peace then? Well, the main event there really in that regard is this international peace conference being held by the Grand Mufti of the Al-Aqsa University, which is the center of learning for Sunni Islam. It's like the sort of Rome for Sunni Islam over there. So he's going there with that intention. He'll be meeting also Patriarch Bartholomew, the ecumenical patriarch for the Orthodox Church there, for that same reason. So it's a real opportunity there to further relations with Islam, which is something very close to the heart of Pope Francis. It should be a very interesting trip, and we'll be following it from start to finish. Ed Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Thanks so much, Ed. Thanks, Wyatt. Coming up, a clash over science, how politics and religion are shaping the debate. And Pope Francis may be from Argentina, but a new exhibit celebrates his Italian roots. On this Easter Friday, we remember St. Anselm, a doctor of the Church and former Archbishop of Canterbury. He was admired for his gentleness and teaching skill. Anselm died in the early 12th century and was declared a saint in 1492. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. Pope Francis makes the list of Time magazine's most influential people once again. He's made the list every year since his election. Others include President Donald Trump, former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. A new exhibit in Rome sheds light on the Italian ancestry of Pope Francis. It tells the story of the migration of the Bergoglio family from Italy to Argentina in 1929. The exhibition also explores the relationship between Argentina and Italy and the massive migration of Italians to the South American nation starting in the 19th century. A new movie coming out this fall focuses on Kermit Gosnell, the Philadelphia abortionist sentenced to life in prison for killing babies born alive. Phelan McAleer and his wife Ann McElhaney teamed up to produce the Gosnell movie. They were skeptical of pro-life beliefs until they started covering Gosnell's trial. That's when they heard another abortionist testify about what she would do with babies born alive.
That you put the baby aside, keep it warm, and it will die naturally. And it's like, so hold on, this guy's been charged with stopping babies born alive, but it's legal in this country, in this state, to let a baby born alive die of neglect and dehydration.
The Gosnell movie will be released in independent theaters this fall. You can learn more about the movie on EWTN Pro-Life Weekly. It airs tonight at 11 p.m. Eastern and again on Sunday at 10 a.m. Thousands are expected to march for science tomorrow in Washington, D.C. and over 500 cities around the world. Organizers say the event is meant to defend the vital role science plays in society. Joining us now is Dr. Stephen Meyer, Director of the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute, a nonpartisan research organization. Stephen, thanks for being with us. The March for Science has stirred up some public debate about the role of science in policy in particular. Some critics say it's very partisan, a very anti-Trump event. What do you have to say about this march?
We'd be among those critics. Many of the propositions that the marchers are marching for aren't really, strictly speaking, science. They're political extensions of particular scientific points of view. For example, many of the marchers are opposed to the Keystone Pipeline or opposed to budget cuts in federal regulatory agencies like the EPA. These aren't scientific propositions or findings. These are political positions. Similarly, a lot of the marchers are motivated by secular humanism. There's a number of 6 or 7 secular humanist groups sponsoring the march. Their view is that science, properly understood, undermines belief in God or makes it unnecessary. That's, again, not a scientific proposition, but a philosophical or theological idea. And so equating science with either political or philosophical ideas and then claiming that that is science is, I think, counterproductive to the cause of science.
You're an expert in what's called intelligent design. And tell me a little bit about what that means, because sometimes
intelligent design is the idea that there are certain features of the biological world and of the universe itself that point to the reality of a designing intelligence and the origin of the universe and the origin of life. It relates to the ancient design argument of philosophers and theologians from the Middle Ages and in the period of the scientific revolution. It's in a way updating that design argument in light of modern scientific discoveries, like the discovery of little tiny nano machines inside cells and the digital code that is in the DNA molecule. Our local hero out in Seattle, Bill Gates, says that DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than any we've ever devised. We know from experience, from our uniform and repeated experience, the basis of all scientific reasoning, that information, especially in a digital form, always comes from an intelligent source. So the discovery of information at the foundation of life, at the foundation of every cell and every organism, we think points powerfully to a designing intelligence having played a role in the origin of life.
Well, as you know, Stephen, everybody seems to have a different opinion on this and unique takes on how the world came into existence, how humans came into existence. But you say, regardless of just the perspectives, there are certain ones that are simply not welcome in this march. As you were saying before, this is seems to be a very politically motivated march. But what perspectives are excluded?
Well, any perspective that's critical of contemporary Darwinian theory, sometimes known as neo-Darwinism. And this is very odd because at precisely the time when you have these very public claims of consensus and settled science in support of Darwinian theory, much as you do with in the global warming controversy, you have leading biologists and even leading evolutionary biologists now rejecting the central claim of neo-Darwinism, which is that natural selection and random mutation has the creative power to generate all the major new innovations that we see in the history of life in the fossil record. Natural selection and random mutation does a good job of explaining small-scale variation, but not large-scale innovation. One biologist says it does a good job of explaining the survival, but not the arrival of the fittest. So lots of leading people in the field rejecting the standard textbook theory, but you won't get a word of that breathed at the March for Science. It's an ideological approach to science saying we all have to line up and get behind this one particular viewpoint, even though there are many dissenting viewpoints in science that are being systematically excluded.
Dr. Stephen Meyer, Director for the Center in Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute, thanks so much for explaining to us about that.
Thanks for having me on, Wyatt.
Up next, hear the story of Sister Claire and how her legacy is still inspiring people a year after her death. and another celebration for the world's longest reigning monarch. Britain's longest reigning monarch turns 91 today. The royal family tweeted this picture showing Queen Elizabeth II at just 1 month old at her christening. The Queen typically celebrates her birthday in private, but she does celebrate a public ceremony in June. Her Majesty marks 65 years on the throne in February. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. We reported yesterday Pope Francis will declare 2 of the children who witnessed the Virgin Mary and Fatima saints next month, but dozens of others will also become saints later this year. The Vatican says 30 martyrs killed in 1645 in Brazil will become saints on October 15th. 3 children killed in Mexico in 1529, Cristobal, Antonio, and Juan, will be canonized the same day, along with Faustino Miguez, a Spanish priest who started a school for girls, and Angelo da Acri, an Italian Capuchin priest and founder of a religious order. 1 year after a devastating earthquake in Ecuador last year, an Order of Sisters releases a new video honoring Sister Claire, one of their members who was killed in the disaster. Sister Kristen Gardner is with that order, the Servant Sisters of the Home of the Mother, and was friends with Sister Claire. Sister Kristen, thanks so much for talking with us. There was a lot of media coverage about Sister Claire after her death, and her story really resonated with a lot of people. Tell us about Sister Claire.
Sister Claire and I met the Home of the Mother almost about the same time. I was 14, she was 17. She arrived in Spain thinking that she was going to go on vacations in sunny Spain, go to the beaches and party, and it turned out that it was a Holy Week retreat at a monastery. I did know I was going to retreat. So during that retreat, she had a very strong experience on Good Friday when she was kissing the cross. She felt that her sins had caused Jesus to be on that cross, and that the only way that she could repair that damage was to give her life to God. So that sort of began a process. She had already been a television presenter on several channels, Nickelodeon, Channel 4 in England. She was already she had had a small part in a movie. Her dream was to go to Hollywood, become famous and rich. So that really just changed her plans totally the other way around.
Why do you think people were so interested in her story?
I think that people were very interested in her story above all because everyone is looking for happiness, and one of her special gifts is joy, and it really, her joy just radiates from her face. So seeing a sister who's young and so happy, it really opens a question mark, and people are like, why is she so happy? So reading her story kind of, I think, answers that question and that search for happiness, and shows the answer that only God can give true happiness.
And you've heard people who converted to Catholicism after learning about Sister Claire. Tell us about that.
Well, the stories that I know most are more people who kind of fallen away from their faith, aren't living it so intensely. There's 2 particular cases of people who knew Sister Claire in life and who, on the day of her death, before they knew she even died, all of a sudden received a grace to be able to completely change their life or realize that they needed to change. And they're like, all of a sudden, like, why did I receive that grace all of a sudden? And then when they heard about Sister Claire's death, like, oh my gosh, that must have been Sister Claire who was giving me this this little bit of help to change. Or there's been several cases of people who have written us who, after reading her story, have had a moment of grace where they saw that they had to change, they had to do something. I mean, we're receiving emails every day with people telling us examples of stories like this.
And you're releasing a video, or you released a video honoring Sister Claire's life. You're working now on a documentary. What do you want people to know about Sister Claire?
The title of the video is going to be All or Nothing. And this is very characteristic of Sister Claire, that when you give something to God, you have to give him your all. You can't just keep half of it back and like live a mediocre life. We're called to be saints, and everyone is called to live holiness to the full. So I think that's the message we want to transmit with this video.
Well, it sounds like she lived an incredible life. Sister Kristen Gardner with the Servant Sisters of the Home of the Mother, thanks so much for telling us about Sister Claire.
You're welcome.
And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll see you back here on Monday. Good night, and God bless.